Welcome back to This is Thailand. I'm glad you're here. Now, if you've spent any time on this channel, you know the kind of stories we tell. You know about the lads who land in Pattaya thinking they've found paradise, and discover 3 months later that the girl of their dreams has a husband in Korat and a second boyfriend in Phuket. You know about the bar owners and the business partners and the men who put a house in someone else's name and watched it disappear. We've told those stories, and we'll keep telling them, because people need to hear them. But today's story is different, and I want you to pay attention, because this one's going to stay with you. And somewhere in those 2 years, something went very wrong. What I'll tell you is this: Brendan came to Thailand carrying something he didn't fully understand yet, and whatever he was carrying, Thailand had a way of finding it. By the time the dust settled, he'd lost a significant portion of everything he had, and the loss that hurt the most wasn't the kind you can measure in numbers. This one's going to make you think, not just about Thailand, about what it means to start over when you're not as ready as you think you are. Here's his story, in his own words. I'll start at the beginning, the real beginning, not Thailand. You need to understand Origna first. Origna was a small place in County Roscommon, up in the hills along the Leitrim border, and for most of the 20th century it had a coalfield. Not a famous one, not the kind you'd read about in history books. Small seams, low ceilings, a place where men went underground in the dark every morning and came back up in the afternoon, and that was the shape of a life. I started there at 18, my father had worked there, his father before him. It wasn't a decision so much as a direction, the way a river doesn't decide to go downhill, it just does. The ceilings underground were sometimes 4 feet. You learn to move in a way that doesn't translate above ground. Crouched, careful, reading the rock for anything that shouldn't be there. A different shade, a small crack, a sound that wasn't quite right. You develop a sense for instability that becomes second nature after a while. You don't think about it, you just know. The mines closed in 1990. I was 29 years old, with a pregnant wife and a set of skills that were no longer required. I retrained into construction, maintenance, mostly electrical systems, structural work, whatever needed doing on sites. Not glamorous, but steady. I worked for the next 25 years, and I was good at it, and I came home to my read every evening, and that was enough. More than enough. We lived in Nena, a house on Barrack Street we bought in 1988, 2 up, 2 down, extended the back when the children were small, Synod Ed and Padraig, Sunday Mass, the GAA, the same pub every Friday. I know how that sounds to some people, small, repetitive. But I want to be honest with you, I was never once bored by my life. I never once lay awake wishing I was somewhere else. I had a woman I understood and who understood me, and that is not a small thing. I didn't know that then. I know it now. Myred was diagnosed in the spring of 2019, ovarian cancer, stage 3. We sat in the oncologist's office in Limerick, and the woman explained what that meant and what the treatment would involve. And I held Myred's hand and I didn't say anything because there wasn't anything useful to say. That's something else the mines teach you. There are situations where talking doesn't help. You just deal with what's in front of you. The first year we were optimistic. The chemo was brutal, but she came through the first rounds and her numbers improved, and we let ourselves believe we were going to be one of the good stories. We were not one of the good stories. By the second year she was losing weight she couldn't afford to lose. By the third year she was 7 stone. I will not go into the details of what it means to care for someone through the last 18 months of a terminal illness. I will only say that it is an act of love, and it is also an act of endurance, and by the end, I had been both of those things to the point of being hollowed out. I slept in the chair beside her bed the last 6 weeks because I was afraid to go to the bedroom in case she needed me and I didn't hear her. She died on a Tuesday morning in March 2021. The neighbors brought food. They came and sat with me, and they were kind, all of them, genuinely kind. And then after a week or so they stopped coming because that's how life works, and they had their own lives and there's no criticism in it. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you so you understand what I was sitting in. The house smelled of her. Her talcum powder, the particular soap she used, the faint undertone of the medication she'd been on for 3 years. I didn't open the windows for 2 months. I'm not sure why. I think I was afraid that if I aired the place out, I'd lose the last physical evidence that she'd been real. I sat in that house for 18 months. I watched television I can't remember. I made meals I barely tasted. I went to Mass most Sundays. Synod rang every Sunday afternoon without fail, and I appreciated it more than I ever told her. Padre came down from Dublin every few weeks, and we'd watch the football together and barely speak, and that was its own kind of comfort. The problem with being a practical man is that you can function perfectly well through almost anything. You can go to the shop and cook your dinner and maintain the house and appear from the outside to be fine. Nobody could see that inside I had become very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with my usual quietness. It wasn't peace. It was the absence of the thing that had made peace possible. I was 63 years old. I had a house that was fully paid off, and a pension, and no particular purpose. and a chest that had been getting worse every winter since I retired. Years of coal dust, the doctor said. Not dangerous, but not going away. A mild wheeze that tightened when the weather was damp, which in Tipperary is most of the year. I didn't know what I was supposed to do next. I had genuinely no idea. I had been a miner, and then a builder, and then a husband, and then a carer, and each of those things had told me what to do every morning when I got up. Now nothing was telling me anything. The silence where the instructions used to be was enormous. I want you to hold that thought, because that silence is where this story actually starts. Not in Thailand, right there, in a house on Barrack Street in Nina, in a man who had been useful his entire life, and had suddenly and completely run out of things to be useful for. That's who got on the plane. That's who Thailand got. It was February, 4 in the morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table with the laptop open because the bedroom had become a place I only went to when I was genuinely exhausted enough to fall asleep before I started thinking. I don't know what prompted me to type it. I've been staring at the screen for 20 minutes watching nothing in particular on YouTube, one of those nights where you click from one thing to the next without actually watching any of it. And then I typed, cheapest warm countries to retire, just like that, no particular intention behind it. Like asking a question you don't really expect an answer to. Thailand came up immediately. Cost of living calculators, expat forums, retirement visa information. I'd heard Ciaran going on about Chiang Mai for 2 years at that point. My nephew Ciaran, my sister Bridget's youngest, had done a backpacking trip through Southeast Asia the year before Reed got sick and had never fully recovered from the experience of finding out that a good meal could cost less than €2. He'd mentioned Chiang Mai specifically. Warm all year, Uncle Brendan, cost of nothing, lovely people, very friendly, you'd love it. I'd nodded and thought nothing of it, the way you do when a 24-year-old tells you about somewhere they've been, and you understand that what they're really telling you about is being 24. But at 4 in the morning in February, sitting in a cold kitchen in Tipperary, I found myself reading about it properly for the first time. The numbers were straightforward. A decent apartment for under €250 a month. Street food for €1 or €2 a meal. Private health insurance for a fraction of what anything comparable cost in Ireland. The retirement visa, they call it a non-immigrant OA, required you to be over 50, which I was, and to show either 800,000 baht in a Thai bank account or a monthly income of 65,000 baht. My pension covered that with room to spare. The warm climate, I'd already been told by my doctor in Nene, would likely help my chest. He hadn't said go to Thailand specifically. He'd said something vague about damp cold being the enemy of lungs like mine. I had made the logical extension myself. I want to be clear about something. I am not a spontaneous man. I have never been a spontaneous man. What happened over the next 3 weeks was the closest I have ever come to an impulsive decision, and even then it was still essentially a spreadsheet. I made a list of what I'd need, looked up what things cost, calculated how long my money would last at different spending levels, read the Thai immigration requirements 4 times, and joined 2 expat forums to ask questions. I did not book the flight until I was satisfied that this made practical sense. The house sold in 4 weeks. A young couple from Limerick. They wanted it quickly, and I had no reason to slow things down. After settling with Sinead and Padraig their share of what their mother and I had built together, which was the right thing, and I have no regret about it, I was left with just over €158,000 sitting in an account. I had never had that much money in one place in my life. I found it deeply uncomfortable. A man who measures his life in weekly wages and monthly pensions doesn't know what to do with a lump sum. It felt like something I was minding for someone else. I told Sinead I was going for 3 months to have a look. She was worried I could hear it, but she's a practical woman too, our mother's daughter in that way, and she understood that I needed something to do. I didn't tell her about the house money, not the full amount. I told her I'd sold it and settled things and had enough to be comfortable. That was true. It was also incomplete. I knew she'd worry if she understood the full picture, and I told myself I was protecting her, which was partly true and partly something else I didn't want to examine. I landed in Chiang Mai on the 14th of March 2022. I had a carry-on bag, a printout of my accommodation booking, and a retirement visa I was quietly proud of having sorted correctly on the first attempt. The heat hit me coming out of the terminal. Not uncomfortable, more like a physical fact. The way the cold is a physical fact in Tipperary in January, but it's opposite. Thick and warm and immediate. I stood at the taxi rank and breathed it in and noticed that my chest felt easier than it had in months. I had deliberately not chosen Bangkok or Pattaya. I want to be honest about my reasoning because it tells you something about the particular flavor of my foolishness. I had read the forums. I understood what those places were. I was 64 years old, recently widowed, and I was very concerned about not being one of those men. The men who go to Pattaya and end up on channels like this one. I had made a conscious, considered decision to go somewhere different. Cultural, I told myself. Historical. The kind of place a person with sense would choose. Chiang Mai is a genuinely beautiful city. I want to say that clearly, because nothing that comes later is the city's fault. The old city sits inside a moat, these ancient walls with temple spires visible above them, and in the morning the monks walk out in their orange robes collecting alms, and the whole thing looks like something from a different century. The streets around Niman Road, where I rented my apartment, are full of small cafes and decent restaurants and markets that appear at dusk along the pavements selling grilled pork skewers and mango sticky rice, and the most extraordinary variety of things on sticks that I still haven't fully cataloged. Ed. My apartment was on the third floor of a low building on a side street off Niman Road, 9,000 baht, a month roughly €220. Air conditioning, a decent bathroom, a small balcony where I could sit in the evenings with a cup of tea and watch the light change over the rooftops toward the mountains. Doi Suthep, the mountain to the west of the city, had a temple at the top of it that you could see from almost anywhere. On clear days, it looked close enough to walk to. I bought a bicycle the second week, not because I needed one particularly, but because buying a bicycle felt like committing to being somewhere. It forced a routine. I cycled to the market in the mornings and bought fruit I'd never heard of, and ate breakfast at a cart that did cow tom rice soup with ginger and a soft-boiled egg for 50 baht. I went to Wat Chetty Luang on 3 separate Tuesdays and sat in the courtyard for an hour each time because something about the scale of it, these enormous ancient structures built by people who were trying to reach towards something permanent, I found it quieting in a way I couldn't explain. Nobody in Chiang Mai looked at me the way people in Nina had been looking at me for 2 years. I don't blame the people in Nina, they were kind. But there is a particular expression that people who know your situation direct at you, a combination of sympathy and mild discomfort, and after a while you start to feel like a problem that hasn't been solved yet. In Chiang Mai, I was just a Farang on a bicycle, a foreigner with a bicycle and a reusable shopping bag buying dragon fruit at the market. Nobody knew anything about me. Nobody was watching to see how I was managing. I cannot tell you how much that mattered. I was careful for 4 months, temple visits, market walks, the occasional beer at a quiet cafe Singha, cold in a glass, watching the street. I found a small restaurant run by a woman who seemed to appreciate that I came back 3 times a week and never made a fuss, and she started putting aside the khao soi I'd told her I liked without me asking. Small mercies. I made no friends in particular, which was fine. I have never required a great number of people. What I was, underneath the carefulness, was slightly lonely. Not desperately, not in a way that alarmed me. More like a low-frequency noise in the background that I've become used to and mostly stopped noticing. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was still settling in. I told myself a lot of things, in those 4 months, that were probably true and probably also convenient. By July, I had established what felt like a life. A small one, a provisional one, but a structure, at least. And structure is what I know how to build. That month, to give myself something social to do that wasn't just sitting in a cafe watching the street, I signed up for a Thai cooking class in the old city. This is where the story changes. I want to be clear about why I joined the cooking class. I've thought about this a fair bit since, because it matters to the story. I had been reading the expat forums since before I arrived. You can't avoid them if you're doing any research at all. They're full of men sharing advice about visas and apartments and hospitals and which areas to avoid, and inevitably, woven through all of that, are the other conversations. The warnings, the cautionary tales. Men who'd lost money to women they'd met in Pattaya, men who'd funded bar tabs and hospital bills and motorcycle repairs, and discovered afterward that the same story had been told to 3 other foreigners in the same city. I read those threads carefully. I took them seriously. And so when I decided I needed something social to do, something that would get me out of my apartment and around other people, I was, and I'll be honest about this, making a deliberate choice about the kind of activity it would be. A cooking class in the old city, not a bar. Not a night market where I'd end up talking to women whose job it is to talk to men like me. A cooking class, daytime, educational, entirely appropriate. The kind of thing you tell your daughter about without any awkwardness. That's who walks into this story next. A man who is so careful about not being the wrong kind of fool that he's created a blind spot the size of a doorway. The class was held in a traditional teak house near Wat Phra Singh, tucked behind a courtyard with a small herb garden out front, lemongrass and kaffir lime and galangal growing in clay pots along the wall. There were 8 of us in the group that day. A couple from Germany, 2 young Australian women who were traveling together, a retired American man from somewhere in the Midwest, and a few others. We were given aprons and shown to our stations, and the head instructor, a cheerful Thai woman in her 40s who delivered most of her instructions at considerable volume, began taking us through the basics of a green curry paste. Nak was the assistant. She moved between the stations quietly, adjusting someone's grip on a pestle, replacing an ingredient that had been measured incorrectly, demonstrating without drawing attention to herself. She was 38 years old, though I didn't know that yet. Small, with her hair tied back, wearing a plain dark top. She helped me with the mortar and pestle. I was making a mess of it, grinding when I should have been pounding, and she showed me the correct motion without saying much, just guided my wrist once and stepped back. I made some comment. I genuinely cannot remember what it was. Something about the difference between this and what I was used to cooking, which at that point was mostly things that came in tins. She laughed. Not a performance laugh, a real one, brief, surprised out of her. And I noticed it because I had not made anyone laugh in a considerable length of time. We talked a little during the class, in the spaces between instructions. She was from Chiang Mai originally, she said, 2 hours north. She had a daughter, 8 years old, living up there with her mother while Nok worked in Chiang Mai. She'd been doing this work for 2 years. Before that, she'd worked in a hotel. She was matter-of-fact about all of it, no drama, no bid for sympathy, just information offered plainly when asked. She said she was tired, at one point, in a way that had nothing to do with the current day. Just a general tired. The kind that lives in a person. I recognized it. It was the only language I'd been speaking for 3 years. After the class, we ate what we'd cooked: the curry, a tom kha gai, some sticky rice sitting at a long wooden table in the courtyard. The Australian women asked Nok questions about where to go in the city, and she answered them helpfully. And then they left, and the American left. And gradually it was just the two of us finishing our food in the late afternoon light, the smell of lemongrass still hanging in the warm air, temple bells, from somewhere nearby going through their slow sequence. We walked afterward. There was no plan to it. We were both going in roughly the same direction, and we kept talking. Past the moat, along the old wall, through a side street where a cart was selling mu ping, grilled pork skewers, and she bought 2 and handed me one without asking, and I ate it, and we kept walking. We had dinner at a small place she knew near the night bazaar. Tom yum, fried morning glory, rice. I paid. Obviously I paid. That's not a thing I noticed at the time. It was just what you did. I want to tell you the thing I noticed, instead. She never asked me anything about money. Not that evening, not in the first week, not in the first month. In the forums, the warnings always included this element. The question about what you do, what you have, where you live, whether you have family money, whether your pension is good. I had been braced for it the way you brace for a particular kind of cold when you step outside. And it simply didn't come. She asked me about Tipperary, about what the mines were like, about my read carefully, not intrusively, in the way you ask about something you've understood is present in a person without being told directly. She listened when I answered. She didn't fill silence with noise. After my raid and I hated myself for making the comparison, I still hate myself a little. I had assumed that part of my life was simply finished. I was 64 years old. I had rough hands and a wheeze and nothing much to offer except my company, which I had no particular reason to believe was worth anything. The thought of any kind of closeness had seemed not just unlikely, but faintly absurd. And here was this woman who seemed to find my company genuinely acceptable. Not exciting, not exotic, just acceptable, in a comfortable way, the way you find a chair acceptable because it fits you. That was the thing. She wasn't performing. That's the only word for what I mean. She wasn't doing anything for my benefit. She was just there, the same way she would have been there if I wasn't. Looking back, I understand that this quality, the absence of obvious performance, can itself be a kind of performance, a more sophisticated one. I didn't understand that then. I told myself I wasn't naive. I told myself I knew the landscape. I had read the warnings, I had chosen my city carefully, I had avoided every obvious trap. This was a woman I'd met at a cooking class, not a bar. She worked for a living. She had a daughter and a tired mother in Chiang Mai, and she asked me about the mines. The first time I gave her money, it was about 3 weeks in. Her motorbike needed a repair, something with the chain. She mentioned it briefly and without expectation. I gave her 4,000 baud, less than €100. She looked slightly uncomfortable accepting it, which I took as a good sign, and thanked me quietly, and that was the end of it. It was just courtesy. It was what any decent person would do. I still believe that, actually. Those first small gestures were just courtesy. That's not where I went wrong. I went wrong much earlier than the money. I went wrong the moment I decided I was too sensible to be in danger. There's a concept that comes up a lot in the expat forums. When men sit around picking over what happened to them, they call it the Thai family tax, as if it's a known quantity you budget for, like a utility bill. I had read about it. I understood the general shape of it, that in Thai culture, family obligation runs deep and wide, that a woman's responsibilities extend to parents and siblings and sometimes nieces and nephews and grandparents, and that a foreign partner with money becomes, in the eyes of the extended family, a resource to be accessed. I had read all of that. What I hadn't understood, and this is the thing I'd ask you to hold on to, is that understanding something in the abstract and recognizing it when it's actually happening to you are two completely different skills. The forum version is a sudden demand, a large figure, A moment where you can clearly see the transaction and make a decision about it. What actually happened was nothing like that. It started around month 5 of the relationship, which would have been the end of the year. Nok mentioned quietly that her mother had been to the doctor. Nothing urgent, just the accumulated difficulties of an older woman living in a rural province without proper health insurance. The local clinic had referred her to a hospital in Chiang Mai for some tests and a follow-up appointment. Could Brendan help with the costs? The figure was 18,000 baht, roughly €440. I want you to think about how that feels from the inside. I am a man from Tipperary. My own mother, God rest her, had needed things toward the end. I understood medical costs for elderly parents. 18,000 baht was less than I'd spent on a single month of Mary Reed's prescriptions. It was less than 1 week's respite care would have cost back in Ireland. It was a figure that, when I held it up against what I knew of human need, seemed not just reasonable, but small. So I gave it. Of course I gave it. About a month after that, Nok suggested we take a trip to Chiang Mai so she could check on her mother. We went up on a Saturday morning in one of the red Sanseiyu shared taxis that run between the cities 2 hours north through rice fields and low hills, the air getting clearer as we climbed. Her mother lived in a small house outside the city proper, near a village I couldn't find on any map. A modest place, concrete block construction, a small garden with chilies and banana trees, chickens somewhere out of sight. The mother was a small woman, maybe 70, who came to the door and performed the way with complete formality when she saw me, hands pressed together, head lowered, the kind of greeting that conveys genuine respect. She prepared food. We sat together and Nok translated pieces of the conversation, and the mother smiled at me several times in a way that seemed entirely real. I had met the mother? That mattered to me more than I knew how to say. Whatever the forum stories were about, they were about a different kind of arrangement than this. 2 months later came the brother. Nok had a brother, I knew this. She'd mentioned him once or twice, who farmed rice land outside Chiang Mai. There was a dispute with a neighboring landowner about a boundary, she explained. Legal paperwork was involved, fees for a local official, some kind of administrative process I couldn't quite follow even with Nok's translation. The amount needed was 35,000 baht. That's roughly €850. That one I sat with for a day before I answered. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. €850 is a different kind of money from 400. It's the kind of money where you feel the weight of it leaving. But I did my own version of the maths that I now understand. I had already begun doing in a particular way. I was still drawing from interest, not capital. My savings were essentially untouched. 35,000 baht on top of 18,000 baht was still less than €1,500 total, which over 5 months of a relationship was, I told myself, not an alarming rate of expenditure for a man in my situation. I was not being systematically drained. These were one-off events with faces attached to them. A sick mother. A land dispute. Real things that happen to real families everywhere in the world. I told myself, the total is still manageable. I drew up no written account. I just held the numbers loosely in my head where they couldn't get too large. Around month 10, Nok raised something she'd clearly been thinking about for some time. She told me she'd been considering her situation. The cooking class work was seasonal. The income was unsteady. She was always moving between 2 places when she wanted to be in one. She said she could be with me more properly and more consistently if she had something more stable. She wasn't talking about marriage, she said. She understood that was complicated. Just stability, something she could count on. She looked, when she said it, like someone asking for something she wasn't sure she had the right to ask for. I ran the numbers that evening on the balcony with a Chang beer and my phone's calculator. 15,000 baht a month. That's €360, give or take. I compared it to what I knew about costs back in Ireland, what a nursing home costs, what a carer costs, what a second household costs. I compared it to what I actually spent on myself each month, which was modest. I found a framing in which 15,000 baht a month was not a significant expense, but a reasonable arrangement between 2 adults managing a shared life across different circumstances. I said yes. Looking back, I understand that this was the moment the nature of things changed, not dramatically, not in a way that felt like a door closing. But the money had found a shape, and shapes, once established, tend to stay. The daughter needed to change school the following spring. An 8-year-old in Chiang Mai switching from a local school to a slightly better one closer to the grandmother's house. Fees, uniform, registration, books. 45,000 baht. A little over €1,100. I had still met this daughter only once briefly on the Chiang Mai visit, and I told myself the distance explained it. The child's shyness explained it. The disruption of 2 households explained it. I didn't examine those explanations too carefully. I paid the school fees. Then in August there was flooding up near the mother's village. Northern Thailand gets heavy rains in the monsoon season, and some years they're worse than others, and this was a bad year. The mother's house was damaged, floor, lower walls, some furniture. The repair estimate was 90,000 baht. Nok told me her brother would contribute half. I agreed to cover the other 45,000, roughly 1,100 euro. I did not ask to see the damage. I did not ask to see the repair bills afterward. Nok went up for a week to help organize things and came back looking tired, and I made her tea and didn't push for details. There was a day around this time, I can't place it exactly. It was an ordinary evening in September, nothing particular happening, when I found myself doing the arithmetic in my head. All of it, added together. The hospital bill, the land dispute, the monthly arrangement across 8 months, the school fees, half the flood repairs. And I caught myself, very precisely, adjusting the calculation, not falsifying it, nothing so deliberate, just allowing my attention to slide over certain figures, to round down here and frame differently there, to arrive at a total that was on the acceptable side of a line I hadn't explicitly drawn. I noticed myself doing it. I registered the fact of it clearly. And then I continued. That is not stupidity. I want to say that plainly, not to excuse myself, but because it's true. Stupid men don't notice when they're reasoning in bad faith. What I was doing was something more specific. I was a man who had decided he wanted something to be a certain way, and I was using my intelligence in the service of that decision rather than in opposition to it. I was minding my own instincts for the load-bearing cracks and choosing not to report them. There was something else I didn't examine. About 2 months after the monthly arrangement began, I went to Nok's apartment one afternoon when she wasn't expecting me. She'd mentioned earlier in the week I might come by, and I'd said I wasn't sure, and then I decided to. She wasn't there when I arrived, but her door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual, and I went in to wait. On the shelf above the bathroom sink there were 2 toothbrushes. She came home about 20 minutes later and didn't notice I'd been in the bathroom. I brought it up that evening, lightly, not as an accusation. She said it was her cousin who'd been visiting from Lampang for a week and stayed over a few nights. I said, all right, fine, and changed the subject. Her cousin from Lampang. Yes. Of course. The guest house idea didn't arrive all at once. That's the thing I want to be precise about, because when you hear these stories from the outside, you imagine a moment, a proposal, a figure, a decision, a clear before and after. That's not how it happened. It was more like a conversation that kept resuming. Nok would mention something she'd noticed about the tourism business in Chiang Mai, how full certain guest houses were, how poorly some of them were managed, how a small, well-run place near the old city could do very well with the right approach. She'd say this and then talk about something else, and I'd find myself thinking about it later, not because I'd been pushed toward it, but because it had lodged somewhere useful. She knew a property. She mentioned this about a month into these conversations. A small guest house near Ta Gate, 8 rooms established, had been operating for years under an older owner who wanted to retire and was willing to sell the lease at a reasonable figure. Nok had contacts in the area. She knew suppliers, knew how the local tourist economy worked, spoke the language obviously. She understood this business in a way I never could from the outside. What she needed was a financial partner. I want to tell you honestly what that proposal felt like from where I was standing at the time, because it's easy to look back and say I should have seen it clearly. But I need you to understand what I was actually hearing. I was 65 years old. For the past 3 years I had been a carer, and before that a construction maintenance man doing other people's repairs, and before that a miner following a seam that someone else had found. My entire working life I had been useful in service of something that belonged to someone else. The mines belonged to the company. The building sites belonged to developers. Even the caring I had poured myself into it completely, and I don't regret a single day of it, but it was not building anything that remained. And here was someone saying, we could build something. Together. That word did a lot of work on me. Together. There was a legal reality I understood, and I want to be straight about it because it's important. In Thailand, a foreigner cannot own a business lease outright in the standard arrangement. The structure that most expats use involves a Thai national holding the legal ownership while the foreign partner provides capital and has an informal arrangement about the operation and profits. I knew this. I had read about it on the forums. Men who'd entered these arrangements and found that the informal understanding and the legal reality diverged at a very inconvenient moment. I understood all of that. And I told myself, I remember the exact phrasing I used in my own head, that it would be in both our names in spirit. I used almost exactly those words. In spirit. As if spirit were a legally enforceable document. As if 30 years underground reading rock hadn't taught me that the invisible load is precisely the one that drops. The transfer was 850,000 baht, just under 22,000 euro, the largest single sum I had ever handed over in my life, including the deposit on the house in Nena in 1988. I transferred it in 2 stages because that's how my Thai bank account worked, and I remember both mornings clearly sitting at my kitchen table, my phone in my hand, watching the confirmation screen, feeling something I can only describe as the particular calm that comes just after you've committed D to something you can't take back. By this point, I had spent roughly €25,000 in total across 18 months. The monthly payments to knock, the mother's hospital, the land dispute, the school fees, the flood repairs. €25,000 over 18 months. I had told myself at various points that this was manageable, that I was still drawing from interest rather than capital, that the arrangement made sense within the context of two adults building a shared life. And now I was adding another 22,000 on top. The total, if I had written it down clearly at that moment, was €47,000, 30% of everything I had. I did not write it down. I had stopped writing things down some months earlier. The renovation period began. Knock handled the arrangements dealing with the outgoing owner, liaising with contractors about the refurbishment work the property needed before it could reopen. I visited the guest house twice in the first 3 months. It was on a quiet lane off the road that runs between the moat and TAPA gate. A 2-story building with white painted walls and a small courtyard at the front where potted frangipani were growing. On my first visit, the ground floor had been cleared out and the walls were primed. On my second visit, 6 weeks later, some new furniture had arrived: a reception desk, several chairs in the courtyard, new mattresses in 2 of the rooms. After that, progress became harder to see. I asked questions. Knock gave answers. The permits were taking longer than expected. There was something with the local authority that needed resolving. The main contractor had a family issue and work had slowed. There was a supply problem with the bathroom fittings they'd ordered. These were all things that happen on building sites. I know building sites. I had spent 25 years on them. I know that permits take longer than expected, and contractors have family issues and supply chains fail. I told myself this was normal. But somewhere in that period, I cannot locate the exact moment, just as I cannot locate the exact moment when you realize you've gone wrong in a tunnel. I began noticing other things that I also told myself were nothing. Not Knock's phone started going face down on the table when it rang. Not every time. Just sometimes. I noticed the first time because it was so deliberate. A deliberate movement, casual on the surface but purposeful underneath. I watched it happen, and I looked at her and she was already talking about something else. There was an evening about 6 weeks into the renovation period when I caught a glimpse of her phone screen. She was scrolling through photographs and she moved quickly past one, but not quite quickly enough. A man's face, standing somewhere outdoors, somewhere that looked like Chiang Mai or somewhere north. I didn't recognize him. I didn't ask who it was. I told myself it could have been anyone. A cousin, a colleague from her hotel days, her cousin from Lompang. Yes, of course, a man. And her answers to my practical questions about the guest house, the questions any legitimate business partner would ask, were getting thinner. How are the permits progressing? She'd look into it. What's the timeline now for opening? It was hard to say exactly. Could we visit again this weekend? She was busy this weekend, maybe next week. I would like to tell you that I confronted these things directly. I would like to tell you that the man who spent 30 years reading underground rock for invisible warning signs applied that same faculty here, but I know what I was actually doing. I was walking into the tunnel and choosing not to look at the walls. I was a man who had built a life around one certainty and lost it, and had spent a significant amount of money and 2 years constructing the closest approximation he could find. And the cost of examining that construction too carefully was something I was not prepared to pay. I knew, not in words, not in conscious thought, in the way that knowledge lives in the body before it reaches the mind. And I kept going. That is the thing I find hardest to explain to people, not the money, not the deception, if that's what it was. The hardest thing to explain is that I am not a man who ignores warning signs. I have never been that man. And yet here I was, walking deliberately, one foot in front of the other, down a tunnel I could feel was wrong, because turning around meant standing in the open air with nothing. I went home on those evenings and sat on my balcony and looked at the lights of Chiang Mai below me and Doi Suthep in the darkness above, and I had my cup of tea, and my chest felt fine, and I told myself it was going to be all right. It was not going to be all right. His name was Gary. That's what he told me later, after it was over. Gary, from Wolverhampton, 4 years in Chiang Mai, ran an online business of some kind that he never explained in detail. The sort of man who sits in the same cafe at the same time every morning because long-term expats develop the same routines that long-term residents anywhere develop, and we'd exchanged nods across that cafe for months without ever really speaking. I was sitting with a coffee and my phone on a Tuesday morning in March. The air quality was poor that week. Chiang Mai gets smoke haze in the burning season when the farmers up north clear their fields, and some years it sits over the city for weeks, turning the sky a flat white and catching in the back of your throat. I had my inhaler in my pocket. I was reading the news from home, the way I did most mornings, keeping myself connected to a country that felt more distant by the month. Gary sat down across from me with his coffee. He didn't ask. He just sat. I looked up and he said, without any preliminaries at all, that he knew knock. I remember the quality of that moment very precisely. The haze outside the window, the sound of a motorbike on the street, the particular smell of Thai coffee, which is strong and slightly sweet in a way that took me months to get used to, and that I have now completely stopped noticing. He said it the way you say something you've decided to say and want to get said before you change your mind. Not unkind, not cruel, flat, like a man reading from a report. She was with a German fella last year, he said. Swedish fella before that. I'm not saying she's a bad person. I'm just saying you're not the first. That was all. He drank his coffee. He didn't add anything. He didn't wait for me to respond. A few minutes later, he said he had somewhere to be, and he left. I sat in that cafe for another 40 minutes. I finished my coffee. I ordered another one. The street outside went about its business, motorbike taxis in their orange vests, a woman pushing a cart of fresh-cut fruit, a tuk-tuk full of tourists heading toward the old city. I watched all of it, and I thought nothing in particular. Or rather, I thought one thing, very clearly, which was that I had known. I had known for some time, and I had chosen not to know, and now a man from Wolverhampton had made that choice unavailable. I went home. I sat in my apartment for the rest of that day. I did not ring knock. I did not go out. I made myself rice and eggs at some point in the afternoon and ate them at the kitchen table, and then I sat on the balcony until it got dark. Doi Suthep was invisible in the haze. The city lights were muted, orange-gray. I thought about my raid, which is something I hadn't let myself do properly in some months. And I thought about the house on Barrack Street that no longer existed in the sense that mattered. And I thought about 2 years. And I thought about the specific number 47,000 euro, which I had, still never written down in one place. The next morning I looked up the guest house address on Google Maps. I had been given the address when we were first talking about the property, and it was in my phone. I found it. It existed. It was a real building on a real lane off the THFI road, exactly as described. And on the satellite view I could see the small courtyard with what looked like the frangipani pots I remembered from my visits. I got on my bicycle, and I rode there. The building looked much as I'd last seen it, though some of the paint that had been fresh 6 months ago was already starting to peel at the edges where the moisture got in. A Thai woman in her 50s was sweeping the courtyard when I arrived. I'd never seen her before. I showed her the address on my phone and she nodded, and I opened the translation app and I typed, "Who owns this guest house?" She looked at the phone. She spoke to me in Thai for a moment, then seemed to understand that wasn't going to work. She took the phone from me gently, the way you'd take something fragile from someone who didn't know how to hold it, and typed in Thai and handed it back. The translation said, "The lease was signed 6 months ago." I typed, "Who signed it?" She typed back in Thai. I read the translation, "Nak," and a man named Sumchai. I stood in that courtyard for a minute. The woman watched me without expression. There were frangipani flowers on the ground around the pots, fallen overnight, white with yellow centers, very still in the smoke haze air. I thanked her. I don't know if she understood that. I got back on my bicycle. I rang knock from the apartment. I asked her to come over. I didn't tell her why. She came that evening. She had a key. She'd had a key for 8 months. And she let herself in and she put her bag down in the hall the way she always did. And she came through to the kitchen and she stopped when she saw my face. We sat at the table. The same table where she had cooked for me dozens of times, pad krapal, kalman gai, a lamb stew she'd learned to make because I told her once that Mayraid used to make stew on Sundays. The same table. I asked her how much of it was true. I said it in the same voice I have used my whole life when something important needed to be said. The same voice I used with mine supervisors, and with the man from the council who told us the Erigna mines were closing, and with Marriott's oncologist in Limerick when I needed to understand exactly what we were dealing with. Quiet, level, not hostile. Just requiring an honest answer, she cried. Not immediately. She held my gaze for a long moment first, and I could see her deciding something, and then she cried. And I want to say this carefully because it matters. I believe the crying was real. I don't think she was performing grief for my benefit. I think she was genuinely upset, in whatever complicated way a person can be genuinely upset while also having done the things she had done. That is not a contradiction I have been able to fully resolve. What she said, through the crying, I won't repeat in detail. There were explanations and there were silences and there were things that were probably true and things that were probably not, and I was not in a condition to assess them accurately. I asked about the guest house and she said it was complicated, and I said the complication seemed fairly straightforward from where I was sitting, and she cried more. After a while I asked her to leave. She picked up her bag and she left, and I locked the door behind her, and that was that. That night I sat down at the kitchen table with my phone and my notebook, and I wrote the numbers down. For the first time since the whole thing started, I wrote them all down in one column, in one place, without rounding or reframing or finding convenient comparisons to soften them. Hospital bill, 18,000 baht. Land dispute, 35,000 baht. Monthly payments across 14 months, 210,000 baht. School fees, 45,000 baht. Half the flood repairs, 45,000 baht. Guesthouse investment, 850,000 baht. Total 1,203,000 baht. Roughly 47,000 euro. Just under 30% of everything I had walked into this country with. The guesthouse money was gone in the sense that there was no guesthouse, no lease in my name, no arrangement of any kind that gave me any legal claim to anything. I was not going to pursue it through Thai courts. I had read enough on the forums to understand what that meant in practice for a foreign national with no legal standing and no contract and no document of any kind. Nothing. I had nothing. I sat with those numbers for a long time, and I want to tell you honestly what I felt because people expect rage, and I didn't feel rage. I felt something quieter and more durable than that. The specific grief of a man who looked at the evidence and chose to keep walking, and who cannot in good conscience claim he didn't know where the tunnel was going. That is its own particular weight. And it doesn't go away quickly. I'm still in Chiang Mai. People ask me why, when I tell them pieces of the story, the expats at the cafe, Gary occasionally, a few others I've become mildly acquainted with over 2 years. They ask it the way people ask a question they think they already know the answer to. Surely you'd want to go home after something like that. Surely you'd want your own people around you. I've thought about how to explain it. The closest I can get is this. Going home would require walking back through a door that I'm not sure is still there. The house on Barrack Street is gone. May Reed is gone. The shape my life used to fit inside has been dismantled, and what I'd be returning to is not Ireland so much as the absence of everything that made Ireland mine. I can sit with that absence here, in the warm, with my chest working properly, just as well as I could sit with it in a rented flat in Nennis staring at weather. That is the honest answer. Not nobility, not stubbornness. Just the arithmetic of where the absence is easier to carry. The numbers, for anyone who wants them clearly, 47,000 euro gone, 111,000 euro remaining. I have my pension coming in each month, which covers my basic costs with some left over, so I am not eating into the capital rapidly. I am 65 years old. If I live to 80, which is not a certainty given my chest, but a reasonable working assumption, I have 15 years to manage what remains. The maths is tight enough to require care. It is not desperate. Some days I believe it is not desperate more than other days. I speak to Sinead every Sunday. She rings at 1:30, which is the same time she always rang, and we talk for 20 minutes or so about her children and the news from home and what I've been eating and whether my chest has been bad. She asks careful questions. She is trying to understand something she knows she doesn't have the full picture of, and she is too considerate to press me directly, and I am too. I want to use the right word too. Ashamed, I suppose, is the word, to tell her the full amount. I have told her something went wrong with an investment. She knows it was significant. She does not know it was 47,000 euro. Padraig has stopped asking. I understand why. He opposed this whole undertaking from the start, and he was right to, and there is nothing comfortable to say to your father from that position. So he says nothing, and we exist in a careful silence that is its own kind of conversation. I don't resent him for it. He's being honest in the only way available to him. So, what do I regret? Not Thailand. I want to be clear about that because this is a channel called This is Thailand, and I don't want to leave you with the impression that the country itself is the lesson. The warm air is real. The food is real. The beauty of this city is real, and it belongs to this place regardless of what I managed to make of my time in it. Chiang Mai did nothing to me that I didn't, in some important sense, do to myself. And I will tell you something that might surprise you. I don't entirely regret Nok either. I have thought about this a great deal and I still can't fully explain it. She gave me something in those 2 years that I hadn't known I needed and didn't know how to find. Whatever the nature of her intentions, the experience of being in her company, the evenings at that table, the Chiang Mai trips, the ordinary Tuesday mornings, those things had a quality that I had stopped believing was available to a man my age. The cost was real. The thing I received was also real. I can hold both of those truths without being able to resolve them. What I regret is arriving hollow. That is the precise and honest answer to the question the title of this video asks. I came here 2 years after Merad died, carrying a lump sum I didn't know how to hold, and a grief I hadn't finished, and a silence where my purpose used to be. I arrived at 64 years old, at the precise intersection of maximum need and maximum vulnerability. An age when loneliness feels most urgent, when the time left to absorb the consequences of a mistake is most finite, when the hunger for a reason to get up in the morning is sharpest. And I had no tools for any of it. I had been a miner and a builder and a husband and a carer, and all of those things had provided their own structure. And without them, I was a man who didn't know how to be alone in a room. The problem wasn't her. I've said this to myself so many times it is worn smooth, but I still mean it every time. The problem was how much I needed her to be who I wanted her to be. I was not deceived by a stranger. I was deceived by my own requirements. I had requirements so urgent that I processed the evidence selectively, flagged the warning signs, and buried the reports. Walked into a tunnel I could feel going wrong because standing at the entrance meant acknowledging that I had nowhere to go. That is what grief does to a man's calibration. It doesn't make you stupid. It doesn't make you blind. It makes you desperately motivated to see things a particular way. And motivated men with good judgment are, in some circumstances, more dangerous to themselves than confused men with none, because they can construct very persuasive cases for the conclusions they need to reach. If you are watching this, and you are thinking about making a big change, after a loss, after a death, after a divorce, after the end of something that gave your life its shape, I am not telling you not to go. I am not telling you that Thailand or anywhere else is a trap. I am telling you to wait until you know who you are without the thing you've lost. Not as punishment, not as caution, just as basic preparation. Know what you're carrying before you board the plane. Know what size hole is in you before you get somewhere that specializes in filling holes. I learned this at 65. It is not ideal timing, but it is what I have. I still cycle to the market on Tuesday mornings. The woman at the restaurant still puts aside my khao soi. The air quality has been better this week, and you can see Doi Suthep clearly from the balcony, the temple at the top catching the light in the late afternoon. My chest is fine. I have €111,000 and a bicycle and a view of the mountains when the sky is clear. That is what I have, and I am taking better care of it now than I was. That's Brendan, 65 years old, from County Tipperary, Ireland. A miner's son who went underground at 18 and worked his whole life and loved his wife and came to the other side of the world to find out what was left. We've told a lot of stories on this channel. Men who lost everything to bar girls in Pattaya. Men who signed their savings over to partners they'd known for a month. Men who went in with both eyes open and had them closed for them. The warnings in those stories are clear and loud, and if you know what to look for, you can spot them from a distance. Brendan's story is harder to protect against, because Brendan did so much right. He chose carefully, avoided the obvious pitfalls, read the warnings, used his intelligence at every step. What he couldn't protect against was what he brought with him, the particular weight of a particular grief, the silence where a life used to be, the need that arrived before the wisdom to manage it. That's the version of this story we don't talk about enough. Not the cautionary tale about the woman or the money. The cautionary tale about what you carry onto the plane. If any part of Brendan's story sounds familiar to you, if you're planning a move, if you've recently lost someone or something that gave your life its structure, if you found yourself running calculations that keep arriving at the answer you want, sit with that for a moment. The plane will still be there when you're ready. Thailand will still be here. Just know what you're bringing. Thank you for watching. This is Thailand. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and we'll see you in the next one.